Good.
Okay, so when you're done, just click that end button right there.
Where?
Right there in the corner.
Okay.
Another dialog box will open up asking if you can say something.
Okay, it looks like we're live here. Welcome everybody to the, well, it's still 4. Should I wait? Just go ahead and get started. It's recording. Sure, let's go ahead and get started. Yeah, we'll start with some introductions. Yeah, welcome everybody to the January 6th meeting of the Business and Community Affairs Committee. Chair Matt Peacock here. Today we have one item on the agenda, and it's to discuss the concept of pattern zoning, which to me is a very fascinating concept, and I think it really make things easier for developers, particularly small developers and infill projects here in Norman. So we're going to be hearing from Matthew Petty and Matt Hoffman today presenting on the topic. So I'm just going to let you guys give a quick introduction of yourselves and we'll go from there.
Sure. Thank you, Matt. We got the 3 Matts. I think this has never happened before, actually, although Matt Hoffman and I are used to having there be 2 of us. We'll mark the occasion. Yeah, we're really excited to be here. You know, we talked about this concept, oh gosh, more than a year ago now in Oklahoma City at a ULI event, and have been privileged to work in another Oklahoma community, Claremore, to test this idea, and we want to talk to you about that case study today. But before all that, my name is Matthew. We're both over here in Fayetteville, Arkansas. I just rolled off of 13 years of service on the city council here. We've been working as private sector city planners, and Matt's an architect for cities for the past 4 or 5 years together. Matt, why don't you tell a little bit about your practice and about MBL?
Sure. Thanks, Matthew. As Matthew mentioned, I'm an architect and an urban designer. Been in the profession for, I don't know, a little over 10 years now. I've also worked as, I chaired the planning commission for the city of Fayetteville for quite a while, and through that work and through our efforts in the private sector, I've gotten to know Matthew Petty over the years. My work is mainly focused on downtowns and infill, and so it was sort of a natural to get into this, and looking forward to the conversation today.
Appreciate that, guys. Well, yeah, Matt, I didn't know if you, or Matthew, I should say, I didn't know if you had a presentation lined up, but I'll go ahead and turn it over to you for that.
Sure. We'll get this loaded here. And Matt, can I ask you to paint a picture for us? Are you all in the room there together, or do we have other people watching remotely, just so we get a sense of kind of how we're presenting today?
Yeah, so the answer is both. I'll turn the camera around so you can see. Or like I mentioned offline, we're in the middle of building renovations right now, so we're kind of limited technology, limited space, kind of just trying to make the best of the situation. But yeah, this is also being streamed on YouTube, the city's YouTube channel, so viewers at home are able to watch as well.
Got it. Well, thank you for having us, and thank you for taking the time. Sometimes committees get a bad rap. Certainly after a long time serving on the council for me in Fayetteville, the Planning Commission for Matt, we've seen our fair share of meetings, but we also know that they can be really important when you get the right people together. And so from what we've heard, this does seem like a really active a group of people who really want to implement things and good ideas. So that's why we're excited to be here and to tell you about what we've been doing. So you may have heard, or you may not have, about the general idea about pre-approving buildings, and that's what we're going to talk about today. We have a system around that we've developed that does a little bit more programmatically than just pre-approving buildings on the building permit level, that actually can make it really easy to get a permit, and especially for developers and builders in your community that are trying or that want to try to build out what you've called for in your city plans. This can be a really effective tool for actually guiding the market to doing those kinds of projects. And we're going to talk about why we wanted to come up with something new, why we thought we had to come up with something new compared to the way most zoning and development codes in cities work. And we call that a pattern zone. This presentation day, it's not going to be, we don't want it to be a super lecture. Matt, please interrupt us if there's something that we say that's jargony that you want to clarify a little bit. And Matthew Hoffman, you too, for the audience, when Matt and I present this to different cities, we have a habit of and a practice of just jumping in whenever there's something that we think is really important to add. So you might see that that Mr. Hoffman does that a little bit, and that's normal. That's how we present stuff. And today for this, we're just really going to try and talk about really what we learned in Bryan and Claremore and why we think this idea of pre-approved buildings works in most cities and why we think it can work in Norman. We've got a lot of experience in university cities or college towns that we think is applicable. Okay, so let's just get into it. If we just want to be accountable and make an observation, it's clear to us when we look at cities, when we study their codes, that despite their plans, despite what new efforts they may have made, oftentimes it doesn't achieve all of the outcomes that were really hoped for, and sometimes not even the most important outcomes that were hoped for. And I think I can admit I've certainly been guilty for this in my career as a public sector employee, was that, we just kind of had hope, and I just had hope and a belief that if we were to change what was allowed, if we were to just update what we were allowing on particular parcels or in particular districts or on Main Street or next to Main Street, then the market would follow. And I think Matt and I have come to understand that that's not a complete understanding. It's just incomplete. And it's certainly important to change what's allowed, but we've also got to focus on these other dimensions that builders and developers make decisions by. Matt and I have built and developed some of our own projects, so we've learned some of the hard lessons with that, and we can read a pro forma and we can understand how a good development works. And in our experience and in all of our focus groups and interviews and everybody, we always talk to what we hear more often than we hear anything else from builders and developers is that they want to do things that are convenient and easy. And in addition to wanting to do things that are allowed and are marketable, convenience of the application process, of the contracting process, and the financing process really drive these decisions. And for us, this realization really explained a lot of our frustrations in our own town and in other cities that we hear from planning departments and from the development sector, that even though things have changed, we're still not getting the kind of market response that we really expected, or that got drawn in the pretty pictures or that sort of thing. This other thing that we've observed is that a lot of times when we have those plans, they do a really good job of showing us where we want things to be in the long term, what we're really shooting for. They have kind of those postcard pictures or those North Stars, and they do a really good job of acting as a touchdown and setting a vision. But all the steps that have to happen along the way usually require a really granular approach, a parcel by parcel approach. And most of the time, our zoning and development codes aren't really set up for parcel by parcel development of the kind that gets called for in our master plans or in our best practices. We try to come up with a way to describe that compares it to the way we might do things conventionally, and we call that incremental development. And to us, this is the same way communities have always grown. At least the ones that are healthy, the ones that are really resilient, the ones that last. And this is probably true if you go out and you start to make a list on a driving tour or walking tour of Norman, and you just start to think of what districts, what neighborhoods, what streets are really cherished by almost everybody, that are almost universally loved. And it's almost always the case in most American communities that those are the oldest neighborhoods that got platted in the city. And we don't think that's a coincidence. We think there are lessons to learn from that and from studying that relationship. And one of the lessons we've learned is that things grew incrementally, parcel by parcel. And new development more or less copied the kinds of things that were already there, to study, to use as an example. And they would get changed and upgraded according to each person's ambition as a project got developed. And neighborhoods can still grow like that. In fact, we believe pretty strongly that that's the best way for most neighborhoods to grow. And it's not that large-scale development shouldn't happen in a community. We believe they should. They should punctuate the kind of urban fabric, the urban landscape that makes up these neighborhoods on a block-by-block basis. But we can't really put all our eggs into the large-scale development basket for a neighborhood or for even a whole community. It's hard to do economic development that way because every win has to be a home run win, has to be a big win. And if those kinds of projects fail, they end up really depressing a lot more geography, a lot more area, a lot more blocks, a lot more streets than they do if a simple small project like a fourplex or a duplex or even a single family home, if that's a real estate failure. And so what we are really trying to do is come up with a system that makes it easy, that makes it actually easy to develop projects like this. And whenever we count, we can actually achieve the same kinds of benefits when we actually account. And when I say when we count, when we actually add up the tax revenues that come from every structure, we can actually achieve the same kinds of tax revenues with incremental development that we might with an approach that's focused on large-scale development. In a lot of cases, we can actually exceed it because the sum of these kinds of projects is a lot greater than their individual parts. And just to put that in context, just imagine the difference between a 200-unit apartment complex and a mix of duplexes and single-family structures that adds up to 200 units. It's an entirely different thing in the community, and one has a lot higher tax revenues than the other. One also has a lot higher resiliency for the kinds of people that can live there, the kinds of communities and social networks that can be supported. So there are a whole lot of reasons that we recommend this kind of incremental approach. And what we found in Bryan, Texas, was that with an incremental approach, we could actually increase the density in these neighborhoods from 3 units per acre on average to more than 15 units per acre on average over time in a way that feels more or less natural and familiar, using buildings that are that take their cues and their inspiration from the buildings that are already there that people already love. Here's the basics on a pre-approval program or the pattern zones that we design and that we think might work for Norman. First, this isn't a replacement program. It's a complementary program that exists alongside the review processes you already have. So whether it's your new downtown form-based codes that are intended for your districts that are next to the university, or whether it's your more conventional codes that deal with some of your corridors or some of your other neighborhoods, if a pre-approval program is right for Norman, it can exist alongside both of those coding regimes. And that's really powerful because it means that whenever we put this complementary program out there, it means that people don't have to pick and choose. They actually get to opt in to this program, and they're not being forced to use a new zoning code. And so it really eliminates and solves for some of those political challenges that come with trying to overhaul a code and trying to do things better. And I don't know if Norman's any different or maybe it's a lot different than Fayetteville and the other cities we work with in this particular regard. But where we go, lots of times, everybody knows changing something is a really good idea, but there's a lot of work that has to go into talking about what changes actually get justified and actually get made. And with a pattern zone or a pre-approval program, from the beginning, it's voluntary to use for applicants. So there's a lot of value in it, which we're about to talk about. That's why applicants might want to use it. But nobody gets forced to use it. If they want to do a custom project, if they want to do a project like the kind that they already do with the permit system that they're already used to using, that still exists. Because it's voluntary, that also means that the city gets to do some really cool things. You know, at the core of this, there's a set of pre-approved plans, and then there's an expedited permit process that goes along with it. So for the first time, you get a set of plans and a set of permits in one review. That means you don't have to go out, if these kinds of projects fit your bill, you don't have to go out and hire the best architect or the best civil engineer. You don't have to find out who those people are, hire a land use legal team to work out your rezoning. If a pre-approved project fits for your goals, then you can opt into this and get the plans and the permit together all at once. So that's a huge value, not just in the actual assets of the plans themselves, but also in the time it really saves you to get to market whenever they're combined like that. Show you some examples real quick of the kinds of stuff that gets permitted. Each of these examples we're going to show you are designs that were actually pre-approved in Bryan, Texas. Since then, we did another set for Claremore, Oklahoma, and we learned a few lessons that we're going to talk about that have changed how we approach things now. But these will be pretty emblematic. Here at the top, you have a set of cottages. These are actually 3 buildings, one on the left, one on the right, and one in the rear. And whenever you look at those, we started with that. We'll show you a little bit more in a minute. We started with that looking at a really lovely cottage that had been in the city for a long time that people knew that they recognized, and it was modest, about 800 square feet. And we asked, what can we do with this and what other kind of formats make sense? And so we looked at some stacked floor plans. We looked at kind of a fancy version that had this porch like you see in this image, and we looked at different ways they could be arranged. At the bottom there, you have what we call the flex house. So this was a unit that was intended for construction by what we might call amateur developers, people who have an inheritance or a nest egg or an ambition to do something in their own neighborhood, and maybe they're only ever going to do one project in their whole lives. But if they wanted to do this flex house, it is designed so that it can be converted from a duplex to a single family or in the other direction at any time in its life. It can be constructed in either format, and it can be converted in either direction anytime along the way. So you can imagine maybe that's good for starter families when kids grow up and move out. Maybe it's good for our seniors who are aging in place. Maybe they need somebody to spend a little time with and to see once in a while. They can live upstairs and be a new friend. Maybe it is somebody who just wants a little extra income so they can take another vacation once a year or upgrade their car or their computer at home or whatever. So we call that the flex house. Then next here at the top, you have what we call the apartment house. This is, believe it or not, a triplex. By the way, Matt designed all these buildings. He's the architect for each of these. And we were tasked in Bryan, this may sound familiar, of addressing what they consider to be a really intense problem, construction of rent by the bedroom, student housing houses. And so they considered those single family by technicality. So they were being approved and entitled under the zoning code as single family houses. And they were being approved under the building code as single family houses, but they were being rented by the bedroom. And they had a moratorium on those, and our highest order business was to try to come up with an alternative to that, and that was this apartment house. And so that's a triplex that is designed to look and fit in with the traditional single-family neighborhoods that were in our project area. And our theory here was that if we could do small format multifamily in a little bit better format, if we could give people a little bit more privacy, if we could encourage owner occupants by including a proper owner's suite, and that we could actually address that housing need and that particular demand segment in a more holistic way, in a better way for the neighborhoods.
Just one more word about, hey Matt, just one more word about the kind of stealth dorm paradigm, because I think this is going to be an important part of our conversation. You know, the triplex up here, that's a building that actually has sort of 3 separate units. It's got 3 kitchens, it's got 3 living rooms that are all separate from each other. And we figured out kind of along the way in the planning process in Bryan that these stealth dorms, these kind of 5-bedroom, 5-bath houses were basically turning into sort of 24/7 party houses. And that was a lot of what was causing friction with the neighbors. And so we figured out that actually, if we make them into separate homes where there's not this common area where people are congregating every day, and even if the people who were renting the bedrooms before weren't best friends, within a couple of weeks they were having keggers, so we just the format and the architectural typology of these buildings and how they fit into neighborhoods is really critical. It's really important. It's something we think a lot about. I just wanted to throw that in there. Thanks, Matt.
No, it's a really good point. And by the way, Matt, did you have something as well?
Councilmember Hall actually had a quick question. Turn it around here.
Yeah, right.
So how many bedrooms are per unit in that triplex?
It varies, and this is another thing that we wanted to do, is we wanted to kind of get a little bit of unit diversity so that they're not all the same. So there's a larger one bedroom that's got a kind of a nicer master. And then there's a couple of 2 bedrooms. And then there's I think actually this unit, if I'm remembering, had even a studio in the back. So there's kind of a variety of different unit types. And on the apartment house in particular, we wanted to make sure we didn't get more than 2 bedrooms in any one unit.
So it sounds like even with this housing type, there's flexibility in choices to meet the particular need for whoever wants to construct it. So it's not just a set interior plan either.
That's right. And, and part of this that we probably didn't have time to completely go into today, but fortunately, we had the budget to do a pretty comprehensive market study to understand kind of demographically where we needed to tailor these buildings within the city. And so that was able to inform us about what kinds of units we needed to supply.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, that's a great question. And, the stuff that Matt's describing are motivation or hypothesis that perhaps if we could have people living in separate units with their own kitchen, their own bathroom, their own entrance, not simply their own bathrooms with a shared kitchen and a shared entrance, that a lot of these problems might go away a little bit more naturally. And these weren't simply guesses. The city actually had preliminary data to support some of these design decisions. On the one hand, they knew that in managed apartment complexes, even though the economic and the social demographics are almost identical in Bryan, in the managed apartment complexes, enforcement actions were lower than these stealth dorms by a factor of about 25. And they had a similarly lower level of enforcement actions on straight single-family houses, even houses that were rented out to student populations. And so there really was a big difference in the outcomes associated with the particular formats of the housing that was being constructed. We'll move on real fast from this architecture, and the last thing we'll show you is at the bottom here. This has been one of the most popular buildings pre-approved in Bryan. This is the Walkup Building, and this came in several different formats. It was originally envisioned as a 12-plex standard apartment, standard attractive kind of bread and butter apartment building that you might see on corridors or on corners or the edges of the transition edges of neighborhoods and corridors. And to that end, it comes with a 2-story version, a 3-story version, so it can scale from 8 units to 12 units. It can include commercial, or it can be fully residential. So the program is really a lot more flexible than maybe just the 4 buildings that we start with. And here's an example of that with the Cottage. So I mentioned earlier that in this diagram here that you saw, that we had a couple different formats with a 1-story version in the back and these 2 kind of fancier side porch double-story versions up front. So from one cottage, which we modeled after something that was lovely and people knew in the city, we had a backyard unit that's over a garage We have a duplex unit that just has an exterior stair, and we have a second duplex cottage that has kind of this fancier porch. And all 4 of these formats are pre-approved in Bryan. And it's not just the building formats. So with that cottage, it could be a primary dwelling, it could be a backyard or a side yard, accessory unit, or it might be included in what we might think of as a pocket neighborhood or as a little cluster of small cottages. And along with each one of these buildings, we include these site diagrams with these annotations to drive adoption of best practices. And here's where the city can really do some neat things for placemaking, because a lot of the things that we'd like to do for placemaking or for design guidelines are sometimes they're a heavy lift. Even if they're good ideas, they can be a heavy lift politically. In other cases, they might be statutorily prohibited from being a general requirement. But this is a voluntary opt-in program. So the city or district developers have a lot of flexibility with this kind of program to, in a more gentle way, drive the use of best practices. In Bryan, we did some pretty banal things with these supplemental site criteria, like prescribing the location for storage of the trash cart, for instance, which wasn't something that was generally regulated but had been a real problem with the stealth dorms. There's a lot we can do with these site diagrams and supplemental criteria to drive particular project formats. And again, none of it is required. It's all voluntary. Last but not least is this example of a pre-approval map. And so we mentioned up front that this can coexist. It plays nice with new form-based codes or old Euclidean codes or any kind of hybrids in between. And one of the reasons is because we leverage this idea of these pre-approval maps, which might be incorporated into an overlay or a regulating map for a district. Here, in this case, it's just illustrative, and this is the pre-approval map for the Walkup Building that we showed you that had so many flexible options. And with this one map, what we've done through several revisions and a community public process in the community is we've shown where it's allowable, where it's pre-approved, not just allowed, but where it's pre-approved to be constructed as a 3-story walk-up or as a 2-story walk-up. That's the difference between purple and pink. And then the underlying zoning code controls where it can have commercial uses included. So we can get really fine-tuned, even at the parcel by parcel level. You can imagine we have our own ideas being outsiders, being consultants, and then those ideas get refined with a core work group, a steering committee, with a planning staff. And then when it gets out there for general public consumption, there might be a VIP we didn't think about, or a street that we just underestimated or got the politics wrong on, or something like that. And so we have to go through these kind of block by block parcel divisions, but we end up with something that really works for almost everywhere that we're studying. Okay, so that's the theory. That's kind of how it works. Those are the major components. The main one being a bundle of buildings that is licensed by a city so that they can, in essence, colloquially, relicense those to any applicant that walks in the door. And that gets associated with an expedited review process that is possible because the buildings, the architecture is pre-approved. And that means real savings. So just in terms of a fourplex, and this is a real project, this was in Bryan, these are the potential savings that you can achieve with a pre-approval program. Right now, we're only talking about architecture. These are straightforward buildings. In some cases, we might be able to pre-approve some of the other design components in the plans. But even if it's just architecture, we're talking about a potential savings of $5,000 per unit in direct costs on a project that's a fourplex. These are in 2017 dollars, mind you. Bear in mind, these numbers don't scale linearly. If we're looking at a single family unit, the savings are not nearly as much because it's already the case that people can go out and buy a set of plans for relatively cheap off of a bunch of different websites from a bunch of different clearinghouses. It's usually already the case that your city has a faster review for 1 and 2 family structures. And so the delta, the arbitrage really isn't as great for the buildings that aren't quite as complex. But on the other hand, buildings that are even more complex than a fourplex, like the Walkup Building, the potential is even higher. And by the way, these numbers, these are just the direct savings that we're showing you here. We're not putting a number to time saved. We're not putting a number to spending less time in design and permitting and actually getting to market faster. And so that savings in time potentially really dwarfs the direct savings that's possible just through the pre-approval program itself. We'll talk to you about our case studies now. We've been privileged to pioneer this idea. There are a couple other cities that have kind of done things independently and are experimenting with accessory dwelling units for pre-approval, and in some cases row houses and townhouses for pre-approval. But so far as we know, the pattern zone approach is the only approach that includes more intense buildings, what we might call middle scale or missing middle buildings, like the walk-up or like the fourplex. And in Bryan, we were able to do that. And we also learned a couple of things. Bryan was the first place that we got to pioneer this idea. So what we want to share are some of the lessons that we've learned. First, we had our idea that there were going to be two kinds of customer segments, if you will, or applicant segments confirmed. So we kind of guessed from the beginning that there would be a class of professional builders or more professionalized development firms, and then a second customer segment of people who are more amateur, who were probably going to do one or maybe even two projects their entire lives. So not really going to have a career of doing buildings and doing development. And in Bryan, we were kind of sort of directed along the way with the team and the stakeholders to design to both of those segments. And what we found is that the kind of professional class of applicants is very interested in the walk-up, and they want to be able to customize it. So we get a lot of requests for the CAD files, and we share those out. And that building still needs a stamp, so you still have to involve an architect even after the city has its process stood up for some of the most intense buildings, because they still have to be stamped. And then for the amateur applicants, what we found is that even though we had a lot of great feedback along the way, and we designed to that feedback, and there was an incredible reception from the public, from the buildings we were proposing for pre-approval, when the program's actually launched, what we see is that on the smaller scale buildings, people need to have a more robust means for either modifying those buildings, or they need a lot more choices than just the 4 or 5 that we can give them with the typical budget. And so we're actually proposing something new. We're building something new on a subscription basis that can increase the number of buildings the city can get pre-approved for the same kind of costs to a couple of dozen to try and solve that problem. And we're about to tell you about that. Here in Claremore, not too far from y'all in the Tulsa region, it's probably fair to think of, at least in the macro perspective, Claremore is kind of a bedroom community for the Tulsa economy. Although of course it does have some of its own important actors in its economic base, especially Rogers University that's there. They just approved their pattern zone on December 6th, so hardly a month old, and they've got 4 projects under active review, and they're about to issue complete packages any day. What's really notable about Claremore is, and especially in contrast to Bryan had a very public-centered process and really wanted us to do a lot with public engagement. And Claremore, we needed to do public engagement, but they felt they had already done the bulk of that in a general sense and were ready for us to really get started with implementing it. And so we worked with a developer partner with the city on a key piece of land downtown to actually pilot the ideas and to co-design or design with their close feedback the first buildings that were pre-approved in Claremore's pattern zone. We call that a quick start program, and that program's about to get permitted and to break dirt. You see a little rendering here of this. This is very close to their Will Rogers Drive, their main street. Claremore's quite a bit smaller than Fayetteville or than Norman. You know, there's only 15 or 16,000 people in Claremore. Compared to Bryan has 90,000 people in a region of about 250,000, and that revolves around the Texas A&M ecosystem. And of course, Fayetteville, we're at about 95,000 in a region of about half a million. And in Fayetteville, we kind of revolve around our university with about 25,000 students. Okay, so here's what we learned, and this is what we'll wrap up with coming up on just about 30 minutes for the slides. We want to focus on the discussion. What remains at the core of the pre-approved building programs and of what we're calling the pattern zone with the extra elements is you have to have a good bundle of buildings and the associated architecture, and you have to have a good licensing regime that works for the city and for the applicants. Most city budgets, they're either going to try and do this on a bare bones basis, or they're going to try to do this on a comprehensive basis, with a whole lot of planning process set up around that. And in either case, the budget for the architecture, if it's custom designed, really only allows for a handful of buildings, just based on the number of hours and the design costs that go along with designing custom buildings. So what we're building now is we're curating a catalog of more than 100 buildings that individual cities can then bundle from, and we can add to that catalog. We can rotate in and out of that catalog, and we can do a lot more buildings than just a handful in the program. So it solves a lot of problems. And this is what we think it looks like. Right now, almost all the planning documents we do, they end up as a booklet or a PDF, and then when we change something, we have to do an addenda or things like that. And that we might be really used to working that way in some of our professions or in government offices, or government might have a reputation for like not quite being caught up with where technology is, and we want to change that whenever it comes to the way these kind of modest infill projects can be pre-approved. And so we want to put this on a portal that starts with an address. You look up your address, you see everything that is pre-approved for that particular parcel. So it should be a handful of single-family buildings, and if it's on a corner or on an edge, it should include a handful of more intense building types like fourplexes or walk-ups or corner stores. And they should be an applicant or somebody who's just browsing should be able to look at the cross-reference details, should have all this in one place. They should be able to make a selection, and whenever they make a selection, they should be able to get these assets, including a set of architectural and design details they can take to a contractor to get a real bid, that they can take to a bank to get a real appraisal, to get a real term sheet, that they can take to a website, or they can take to a graphic designer, they can take to a realtor to assemble a marketing package. And our idea here is that if you can get the pre-approval program set up and you can subscribe to this portal, then what you'll have now is you'll have a means that didn't exist before. You'll have a means for people, whether they're professional developers or whether they're amateurs doing a pet project, they can submit with one click an inquiry to get the review process started with an assembled package of these things ready to go, that can go straight to the clerks at the planning office. So our goal here is really to radically lower barriers to the right kind of projects. We want to make it a lot easier for neighborhoods to be constructed and to grow the way that they have traditionally, which means with projects that are real similar to the kinds of things that are already there, that are already familiar. And it also means with a system for review and approval that is accessible to just about anybody, so that you don't really have to know the best team in town for architecture or for legal work or for whatever it is, just to have what you need to even think about taking on a project. And we think if we can do that, it really changes the way neighborhoods can grow and changes the politics around a lot of these kinds of decisions whenever we talk about growth pressures and latent demand. We'll end here. These are the kinds of typical questions that we get. We'll just kind of put this on the screen. We expect that this is going to be a dialogue, and that you might have a lot of questions or things to discuss between your hopes or ideas or clarifications for where this might be applied in Norman. So Matt, we'll turn the floor back over to you.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate the presentation, guys. It was very in-depth and insightful. It's like I said in the opening, it's a topic that's been really fascinating to me, and you hit on a number of reasons why, namely that it really does lower the bar for small developers to do quality infill projects. And I think that's something we're really severely lacking in Norman, especially in a lot of our historic core neighborhoods. So I'm really interested in kind of seeing what the next steps are on this, but I do have a couple questions just to start things off with. How do local architects fit into the equation? I mean, is there a process to which a local architect could submit a building for pre-approval and get it worked into the system? Or is that kind of a closed door? How would that work?
Yeah, go ahead, Matt. You take that one.
Yeah, certainly that's something that we're open to as far as including local architects in the catalog. That's actually one of many reasons that we decided to move to a catalog-based system. Of course, the catalog currently includes a lot of other architects other than just us, other than just me, and that was kind of the point all along. So that's one answer to the question. The other answer to the question is that in most places where we've worked, Brian aside, most of the buildings that we're working with are well below the threshold that would require an architectural stamp. So in Claremore, for example, none of those buildings, and that set included some rather large walk-up buildings, but none of those buildings in Claremore actually required an architectural stamp. But also, we're really trying to hit that missing middle of buildings where that kind of march right up to the line of requiring more expensive professional services, but don't actually cross it. Does that make sense, Matt?
Yeah, and I would add to that. We really want in cities to work with competent and respected local architects and to get them in the catalog, and that's kind of the full stop simple answer. But the follow up to it is it's still important for us to be curatorial because the program, if it's successful, is going to be very successful. It's going to drive the construction of the kinds of buildings that are pre-approved in it. And so that's one of the reasons, and perhaps the main reason, that we talk so carefully and so much about respecting what we call the familiarity principle or the familiar conditions that are already there in the neighborhood. And that does not mean that we think every building should be a copy. But it does mean that we think in terms of pre-approvals, variations on the theme that's already present are important for political reasons in getting the program adopted and supported. Remember, it's a voluntary program, it's an opt-in program, it coexists. So anybody who wants to do something that's avant-garde or experimental still has a process to get those kinds of projects approved. And it's important for us to remember that we have a duty to the public in terms of the city in why they have to do reviews and what level of review is really important, whether those reviews are pre-approved or a light review or a modest review or a real heavy review like you might see for large-scale development. And we want to make sure everything still respects and exists on that kind of a spectrum.
Oh, excellent. That's you actually kind of touched on my other question, and it was that the areas that we envision a lot of this going into are full of very passionate neighbors. So what is your public engagement process look like for something like that?
We do public engagement as robust as we think we need to, which is to say we believe it's really important. And we often find ourselves in a position of trying to convince municipalities and their staffs and our stakeholder committees that perhaps we need to even do a little bit more or a little bit more targeted engagement. So that's to say, for us, we like to work on a pipeline that goes from our work based on best practices and our observations, and then through a core work group, and then a broader steering committee. And that steering committee needs to be composed of people who can be champions, who will actually put the time in to understand the decisions that are being made, and will go out and explain it and answer questions when necessary. And so we like to do a series, a sequence of focus groups, interviews, and then finally town hall formats to present the decisions that have been made along the way and to collect feedback for revisions.
One other thing about the engagement that I want to point out, there's a really important difference between the kind of engagement that we do on a pre-approval program and the kind of engagement that maybe you all might be used to on a kind of typical planning project. And it has to do with the deliverable, right? People intuitively know that zoning is a little bit complicated. It's a little bit of a black box. It takes a certain level of sophistication to understand what those written words have to do with what might end up. And so they're inherently skeptical of it. And probably they should be, if we're being honest. When you're doing a pre-approval program like this, we have the capability at the office to actually print out a lot of the different buildings, do 3D prints of them. So they're little sort of brick sized buildings that we can actually pass out to people. And there's this, we've done this enough to where I've seen it several times now. There's this aha moment that people have when they can have a physical association with something like that. That's not in a drawing. It's not just, it's not written down in some description somewhere on lines, C-E-B or whatever that they have to interpret. It really kind of calms people down, frankly. And several times has led to a situation that's actually surprised us where the neighbors and the stakeholders involved have actually pushed a little bit farther than even we thought that they might be willing to go in terms of increasing entitlements for a place, just purely based on the quality of the design and the fact that it's a concrete thing, physical thing that you can understand and look at and feel and touch and talk about.
Yeah, maybe the best example of that working for us is this apartment house that Matt designed that we talked to you about just a little bit earlier. How many times have you heard in a zoning hearing, well, this all sounds really good, what you're telling us is going to happen, but is it really going to turn out that way? And then you get 4 or 5 other people coming up to the podium behind that person, and they start to say the same thing, and it catches the momentum. And then all of a sudden, what may have been a very good project is mired in the public perception of it, and the public perception may have just been wrong. Not saying that it's wrong in all cases. Sometimes that's very important, and in other cases, it's just a fact that sometimes the story about a project gets away from us. And one of the things that these pattern zones we've observed is really good at doing, and this is one of our original hopes, so we feel really vindicated that this has proved true so far, is we're saying it's this building. It's this building that is getting pre-approved, not one like it. It's this building. And we say where the walk-ups are going, it's this building and these options that are getting pre-approved, and not a general apartment building. And that is a huge shift, because when people see these things, when they see the model that Matt talks about, or whenever when we show the photographic surveys that we did of the buildings that they told us they really liked, and we show how they inspired the design decisions that we made architecturally, they start to believe, it's remarkable, they actually start to believe that we're going to produce what we're telling them. And that's really what the system is designed to try and drill into and leverage and build a program around from the beginning, because it's complicated like that almost everywhere.
What a noble concept, doing what you say you're going to do. That's
Right.
I'll go ahead and open it up for questions from my colleagues if you guys have any. Councilmember Hall.
Well, I'm going to kind of skip around a little bit, but when you're talking about doing the building design, how do you, okay, so the work that you've done in Bryan, I've been intrigued with ever since I participated in that ULI workshop that you're talking about, because there's so many similarities to Bryan, Texas, and the kinds of challenges that we're seeing here in Norman. So I've been really intrigued with this idea, and especially how you can apply it in core Norman, where the pressure on the student housing rental market is enormous, as you can imagine. So how do you work out the parking solutions that go along with this increased density?
Matt, do you want to pull up a site diagram, or we could talk about that a little bit? So basically what happens with each type of building is that each type of building is associated with a lot diagram, and that lot diagram is based on, you know, sort of the average lots that we actually see on the ground within the study area. So these are lot diagrams that are associated with the cottage. We have others that are associated with the walk-up and with the flex house and with the apartment house, and they detail in pretty specific terms, you know, things like what are the minimum number of parking spaces, where can they go? Generally, that's beside or behind the building. We're also able to deal with situations like in Midtown Bryan, for example. There was not an existent system of alleys, and so in order to deal with situations where we might have, you know, multiple pattern zone projects taking place along one block face, we wanted to keep from having, you know, just driveway after driveway. So in that situation, we actually required cross access to take place in the rear, so it kind of became a way to build on an alley system where one wasn't existent before. All of this is wrapped up in what we call supplementary criteria, and those criteria are associated with each building type, and they detail everything from, again, the parking standards to landscaping standards to architectural variation requirements. So, you know, requirements that you can only build X number of variations in a row before you have to kind of mix it up. This supplemental criteria is where we're able to put all of those standards that Matt talked about that might be a little bit more difficult to do if you were just doing this as a straight zoning amendment, but because this is a voluntary program, we can ask a little bit more from a quality perspective. Does that answer your question?
So the supplementary criteria, is that applied per parcel, or is it part of a broader context for what you're trying to do per neighborhood, say?
Yeah, it's sort of a deal that we're making with anyone who wants to have access to one of these pre-approved buildings. You know, the deal is if you want the expedited process, and if you want the architecture, in exchange, we're asking you to raise your standards and do X, Y, Z as you build this property. So it would apply to the parcel and the building where that's actually undergoing construction. It wouldn't apply to neighboring properties, I guess. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it does, because it seems like that is really, you know, one of the challenges we're facing. You know, we spoke not too long ago with various neighborhoods in Core Norman that are dominated by student housing types, but particularly right now, we have a challenge in our Center City form-based code. And of course, it is the oldest, most cherished part of Norman, and a lot of historical buildings. And, you know, a big part of our story is all in these areas in Core Norman and the connector neighborhoods from downtown to the campus. And so what's intriguing to me about this is just this potential for this infill development, that you can address this lot by lot, and as you say, consider all the supplementary criteria that needs to go along with it to have a great building project. So it's really a comprehensive development of an infill lot, is what it sounds like you're saying.
Yes, and when we draw these site diagrams for each building, we try to draw one for each kind of logical approach to parking. And yeah, our goal, the information on parking aside, our goal with the site diagrams and the supplementary criteria is to make it so that somebody can look at their choice for a pre-approved building and the associated parcel, and can more or less be done with the site design and the building design, because we've already drawn what is typical. And, you know, that also implies that you can't apply this to every single parcel in your plat, because you're going to have parcels that are irregular. You know, they might be a triangle, and that we can't pre-approve something on that because it doesn't fit in the system. They might have a stream going right through the middle of it, right? A pre-approval on something that's sensitive like that doesn't make sense. But that's really our goal, is if you have a typical parcel, between the site diagram, the supplemental criteria, and the actual architecture, you should pretty well have your design package done.
So, I've also really been trying to keep up on how you have evolved with your approach with pattern zoning from the work that you did in Bryan, and now moving to this online subscription portal. But with your experience in Bryan, so how interested have small developers been in choosing this route over just doing their own traditional regular planning process? Has this really caught on in Bryan, or how's it going?
Yeah, yes and no. Frankly, the uptake is less than we expected. But we've done a really diligent job in some post-planning surveys with staff and interviews with staff to try to understand why. And so here's the conclusions we've drawn. One is it's a fact that interest is very high, and our expectations for inquiries kind of matches what has happened. But what we're not seeing are the follow-on actual applications for permits. And what we've discovered is that even though the buildings that got pre-approved were well received, and you know, we did have critical feedback along the way. We had a process of revisions, but at the end, everything was very well received, and we had a lot of people get put on the list, and we continue to get notifications about it, and the city continues to get a lot of inquiries. What happens is they want to make changes because these buildings are for their own personal use. And so they want to make changes, and they expect to have the ability that those changes are going to be easier than they are. And so the lesson we learned is we have to find a way of pre-approving a greater variety of buildings, a higher number of variations on the themes that we're discovering in those public processes. And the way to do that for us, what we've discovered is that has to be a subscription model, just as a function of what municipal budgets are and how much departments have to spend on architecture. There has to be a different cost model for that if we want to get into dozens of buildings, which is where we think we need to be to really drive uptake among that so-called amateur class.
The other, sorry, just to hop in, the other kind of lesson learned that actually isn't on this slide. You know, we had a really robust engagement process in Bryan. We had, you know, I think it was 3 or 4 meetings that were attended by hundreds of people. It was really pretty impressive. And what happened is we did that, and then nothing happened for well over a year. There was some other sort of city politics issue having to do with a city park and some other stuff that apparently didn't have anything to do with our project, but nonetheless delayed adoption of the pattern zone that we had been talking about and sort of publicly promoting and having all these meetings and getting all this traction. All that just went away for well over a year. And at the end of the day, when it finally was adopted, as we've said, it wound up just sort of being a PDF on the city's website somewhere. So, you know, that's where we think, you know, driving engagement through the process and straight into adoption and into this web portal that's obviously much easier to get on people's radar. We think that's really important, and that's what we've seen in Claremore, where there was a much more seamless integration of engagement efforts starting before we got there, through our process, into adoption of the program, and now into you know, actually getting buildings off the ground.
You moved Claremore and Bryan. is there a plan or a process to be moving them to this online subscription model, or is that in process for new municipalities that you might be working with?
There is Claremore. We have an intent expressed from them to go ahead and move into this subscription model, and we haven't gotten in as detailed a conversation with the city of Bryan about that, but Claremore is very much ready to move in this direction.
So my last question, and it's something that we touched on briefly not too long ago. We are currently, we just passed an administrative delay for any new construction in our Center City form-based code in our Center City boundary area. And one of the things that I have been intrigued with the idea of applying this whole concept of pattern zoning is the very real-time challenges we're having with small developers, really incremental developers, that are trying to come up with solutions for our residential corners in Center City form-based code. So I was intrigued with your mention in Claremore that they considered the work that you started with them as a pilot project, and that you were focused on a single building type. I think you said single family, compact single family home or something like that. And so what I'm hoping is, as we continue the discussion, that one of the places that we could start is taking a look at this particular design challenge to see how this all works, and then how we can expand that perhaps to solve some of our Center City issues, but also particularly in core Norman, I see lots of historic neighborhoods that are, being threatened in one way or another that could really benefit from this kind of collaboration and partnership, and having the city being put in a position to, really meet what we're hearing from the community, not necessarily the development community, but what we're hearing from our community of we are still missing middle housing, which is something that through the form-based code charrette process and just other neighborhood conversations in historic core Norman of finding that transition, and as you said so eloquently, these cherished neighborhoods and these cherished parts of town where we understand that we need to continue to grow and to increase density, but more in an incremental way. And instead of starting with a parcel that had 4 occupants, and now we have 8 or 12 bedroom units with individual bathrooms, just like you said. So I'm really intrigued with how you went about solving the issue that we are still challenged with, and that is getting a single housing type in the center of town, that the community was expecting a lot of choices in housing types and a lot of different types of people being drawn to this area, this, jewel of a connector neighborhood between campus and downtown. And we're just not seeing that. Since 2017, we've literally built the same housing type over and over and over again. So I really see this as a path to breaking that open, and at the same time, making it easier for our small developers to not have to navigate this, complex form-based code where projects are taking so much time to get to the approval, and they would be saving so much just on time, energy, design, not requiring legal intervention, not parsing words in a code. So I see this as a path to really engage our small developers in Norman and in the metro area, and perhaps get other people interested in, some creative problem solving, and be able to get into fast tracking and building good projects that the community is excited about too. So.
I appreciate those comments. And before we go really much further, I just want to let everybody know we've got about 15 minutes before we have to relinquish this room. So make everybody cognizant of that. But Councilmember Holman.
Sure. Yeah. I appreciate both of you being on with us this afternoon. And This is definitely something I've been interested in for a long time. And the incremental aspect of it, which I think of as the strong towns approach, what I read about, and being able to allow individual small scale developers and just individuals that have a piece of property that they would like to redevelop, but preserve maybe some of the character of what's there, but without having to go through the expense and time of hiring attorneys and architects and city council approval and things like that. So that really appeals to me, and not just in the center city area, but definitely in many neighborhoods across the city that could benefit from this type of things as homes get older and some of them may not be able to be repaired or restored in a certain way and might need to be reconstructed. So I'm definitely interested in this whole process, and I like the opt-in part of it, to give people a chance to have with the existing zoning, or to go through what we would call a PUD if they wanted to do something different than the existing zoning, but they also did the pattern zoning. So, but having those options for people, I think, is the real good thing about it, is just having multiple options and making it simple so that not only the person trying to develop can understand easily, but that the neighbors around the area can look at these plans too and say, if the property next to my house was going to be redeveloped, this is what it could look like, and this is what I do or don't like about it. So I think it does give just more certainty to neighbors and to people wanting to build. And so I've definitely been interested in this idea for a while in Norman. I'm really excited that we're able to finally have a real discussion about it.
So, Councilmember Peacock, this conversation, I think, is an excellent example of how our process works. And when we look at local government operating in a budget cycle, it starts with a council gathering to discuss goals and objectives, and this was one of those conversation topics. And once it gets consensus at the level of goals and objectives, we find spots on calendars and council committees to shine the first light on the subject, and staff seeks council consensus that what you see is what you're interested in advancing. And from staff's perspective, we are recognizing council consensus at this meeting. Jane Hudson has flagged the city clerk to pencil us in potentially for a February 1 study session with the whole council available. If that works for this council's consideration, we'll go ahead and make preparations for the full-blown presentation in front of the council, and in a setting that's a little easier for the community to come in and watch. And we'll from that study session, we would prepare any council actions necessary to advance the concept to something that would be codified, and we'd be jumping in with both feet. So if this is the path this group of participating council members sees as appropriate, we will proceed headlong.
As you alluded to at our council retreat, we did identify this as one of our top priorities and goals. So yeah, you certainly have consensus around this table. Matt, does that February 1st date work for you to do an in-person presentation at a study session?
That works for me.
We will make provisions.
Okay, we'll make some arrangements to make that happen. I appreciate that, City Manager Pyle. Did anybody else have any other questions before we kind of wrap up? All right. Well, I mean, I think you guys answered a lot of our questions and concerns, and I'm certainly looking forward to our February 1st presentation when we've got the full council and mayor. And if there's anything you guys need from us in the meantime, just don't hesitate to reach out.
Great. Thank you so much for having us tonight.
Appreciate you guys. Thank you.
Looking forward to meet you all in person. Thank you.
Likewise.